from Columbia in high definition. This is WIS News 10 Awareness.
These are the now familiar images coming out of Ferguson, Missouri. Messages of justice, feelings of rage, the unrest just as palpable as the tension. So where do we go from here? Thank you so much for joining us this morning for Awareness. I'm your host, Megan Norman. A lot has developed in Ferguson and around the country in the last week in response to the shooting death of 18-year-old Michael Brown by a police officer. The teen has been named a suspect in a robbery that happened just before his death. After the shooting, looting and other criminal activity continues. Tear gas and rubber bullets have become commonplace. National Guard troops have now been called in to keep the peace, while the Department of Justice is conducting its own investigation. And the cries for justice and peace have only gotten louder.
Justice can and will come, but St. Louis County, Ferguson, you must continue to stand and be heard.
There are still many unanswered questions while the trust in the town remains broken. We are continuing our conversation from last week. Bishop Eric Freeman from the Meeting Place Church is back, joined by Reverend Adam China of Adams Northeast AME Church and Jaquetta Chapman, the founder of Mothers of Black Boys. Now, we see these images on TV, on social media. To me, it seems reminiscent of the 1960s in the Deep South, minus the fire hoses, minus the dogs. What kind of message is this sending to our country and to Black America?
Well, Megan, again, I want to thank you for continuing to bring awareness to these important issues in our community and our nation. And when we see these images, minus the hoses, not necessarily minus the dogs at this point, I do think that it is reminiscent of a time that was very painful for African Americans here in these United States. I also think that we cannot dismiss the cry, even if we don't agree with exactly how the cry is being expressed. We do have to take note of the fact that there has to be a legitimate source of these symptoms. And I know for my 16-year-old son, my 19-year-old daughter, seeing these images, there's no doubt that it, in some way or another, invokes concern. And yet, in some way or another, confirms an undercurrent that a 16-year-old African-American male kind of already feels. Right. And so this is an important time for our nation to be in discourse and dialogue. Not only is our nation looking, but the entire world is looking at how it is that we navigate these types of difficult moments.
So how should we be addressing this issue? I guess a lot of people say there are right ways and wrong ways to do this. So how should we be doing this to achieve justice if that really is the ultimate goal?
The incorrect way to deal with it, Megan, is the looting. The incorrect way to deal with it is to go out and act in a manner that will get you in jail. What we should do is spend some time talking to our children about appropriate behavior, ways to not bring attention to yourself when it comes to being out with friends and in the in the public eye. What we should do is spend some time discussing the issue with our children so that they will not be afraid of the police. Get them involved in some type of community forum, if there is such, that brings healing, right. Nothing that's going to take them into a place where they're angry.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about that healing, Reverend China. This has been going on for weeks now, and it seems like the violence has ramped up, the unrest has ramped up. Has too much damage been done at this point to really begin to heal?
Well, I don't want to say it's too late to heal. I would just say it's going to take a lot more work now for the healing to take place. And I think one of the things that's going to happen in that community especially is that you're going to have community leaders sit down with some of the town councilmen and so forth. And they're going to have to be the ones to try to start the healing at least. And understand this, what's happened in the last 11 days, it's really going to take years to rebuild that trust between the police and the community. It's not impossible, but it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take them sitting down and being honest about what happened, the police acknowledging that they have not handled everything the right way, and the community acknowledging that some of this looting and so forth, that's not the police, that's on us, because I've seen over the last several nights where you had the police who were not necessarily doing anything, and granted, I'm not saying they're innocent, but we've seen times where people were throwing things at the police, throwing the cocktail bombs and all the other things that we've heard of. And so at the end of the day, what they're doing, although they're angry, and I understand that, the Bible says, be angry and sin not. So you can be angry, you can protest, you can march, that's fine. But it's going to take the community policing themselves and letting these people who are doing those things know that we're not going to tolerate it either. Don't just wait for the police, they have to handle it also.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the police response. And first, I want to talk about something that a lot of us haven't really discussed, but should there be support for the officer involved in this?
Certainly there should be support for him. I mean, his supervisor, if whomever feels that he is justified, then certainly he should have support. If he's able to justify his actions, certainly.
And I think to a great extent there is support for this officer. And so a part of the reason that we did not know who the officer was for so many days was that there was due process that was in place to protect the officer. Those were the exact words that were used. And a part of the reason there has not been an indictment brought against the officer is that there is support for his constitutional rights. I think the bigger challenge and bigger concern that we are hearing with regards to the Mike Brown circumstance is it does not seem that a due process was there for him.
Right.
And I think to your question earlier, and something that Reverend China said and Dr. Chapman said, this dialogue, this discourse, being able to converse is so important. And so we need to give voice to our young people so that they can navigate these difficult situations. But we need to have important discussions with our legislators and our leaders so that we can all come to the table and say, we all own something in this.
Right. Well, we are just getting our conversation started, so stay with us. After the break, we'll be continuing our conversation. Welcome back to Awareness. Let's get right back into our discussion. A lot of comments I've seen on social media talk about why is everyone so up in arms now when a white man kills a black man, when there's so much black on black violence happening, and they cite Chicago as an example. Can you really relate the two situations in this case?
Certainly. I think that it is a bit of a syllogism to make that argument. I think the greater issue is not just the color of the man that killed the boy, but his responsibility as an officer. It's one thing when we see that two peers have behavior that is certainly unacceptable. It's another thing when those who've been called to serve and protect and who we've trusted to serve and protect seem to exercise an atrocity against someone, and the only distinction we can seem to see is because of the color of their skin. But again, I think it is the authority that that person has that makes it so concerning.
Right. But the fact still remains that black boys, black men are getting killed on a routine basis, unfortunately. So what are we supposed to be telling our black children?
That we've got to look at this situation and think about the actions that we pose on the community when we are against one another. We've got to, now it's time to bring the family together. And I think that's a strong message that we need to send. Now is the time to bring the family together from what it used to be. And we need to begin to take care of each other and support each other and not fight against each other. This is a great learning experience, a great opportunity for families to now come together and stop. Let's talk about how blacks used to hold hands and walk down the street when, you know, during the Martin Luther King era, and how we were a prideful community. We took care of one another. We need to go back to those days. Now is a great time to have these teachable moments for our families.
Now, is the church one place where we need to start these conversations?
I think so, yes. I think the church, I mean, if you think about the civil rights movement, it started with the church. You know, it was Dr. King and many other ministers who came together and figured out how they could rally their members together and that's really, that was the starting point, was the church. And the church, but it's not all on the church. This takes the church, the business community, it takes our legislators, it takes everyone, and it takes everybody taking personal responsibility. And just going to what you were saying earlier about black on black crime, that's a real problem. We have to handle that. And again, it's up to us to fix that. But at the same time, when you look, and I think we also need to say that we don't want to say that we're beating up on the police, because I think we have a lot of wonderful, dedicated people in law enforcement. And I'd say the large majority of them are doing very well, and they have a true heart for the community. But when you look at these shootings, African American men are disproportionately shot and killed, and in many cases unarmed. If this man was armed, if he presented, I don't think you'd have an outcry from the police. Right. We've seen that before, where police have been attacked and they have shot and killed, and we say, hey, we don't want anyone to die, but we understand that it was justified. But how many times have we seen where young black men were not armed and being shot 6 times, and you're unarmed? You can't say you were defending yourself, not shooting 6 times, right, at least.
Even though they're saying, well, a fight ensued prior to all of the gunshots being fired, and he was acting in self-defense, but you still think?
Well, and if he shot him once in self-defense, maybe even twice, but 6 times, and if you saw the results of the autopsy that they did, that kind of cut the legs from under that argument. Right. So again, I don't want to seem like we're against the police, because I'm not anti-police at all. Again, I think we have a lot of dedicated men and women in law enforcement. But in this instance, and in instances of others that we've seen over the last month, again, we're talking about Mike Brown, but we've had so many others. Right. We had, Eric Gardner. You had the gentleman in Ohio, I think Crawford was his name, who was killed in Walmart. And you've had so many in Los Angeles, which I do applaud the fact that the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department a couple days ago released an article acknowledging they made a mistake in killing him. And that life is still gone. Right. But that does bring healing, that they acknowledge, we handled this the wrong way.
So does Ferguson need to apologize?
I think to a large part they do. And what scares me personally, even more so, is that, okay, we know that, if they try him, if he's charged, this officer, and they try him, I'm afraid that if they don't get a conviction, we're going to see this all over again in a couple of years.
So then what's the main lesson that we need to take away as a community from this whole situation?
Well, I think doing what we're doing is an important part of it, these types of discussions. But I also think, again, everyone coming to the table has to take some ownership. And so I think it is irresponsible and remarkable for anyone to say that justice in our nation is colorblind. And I think some of the statistics that Reverend China just shared speaks to that. And I think the fact that Stephen Hawkins, the executive director of Amnesty International, was on the ground in Ferguson and said even these particular individuals that were protesting peacefully were handled in ways that were clear violations of what the UN has said is appropriate for addressing protest. Right. And I think, so when we come to the table, everyone has to come to the table owning some responsibility.
Well, thank you all so much for being with us. I know we really just hit the surface of this complex issue, but thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Well, this topic of teaching our young black boys and raising them right is a conversation we want to keep having, and we want you to stay engaged. Head to our Facebook page and tell us what you think when Awareness returns, evaluating the police response. Tear gas and tanks, assault rifles loaded and pointed at citizens in the streets. The National Guard now on the scene. But first, Ferguson Police was replaced by Highway Patrol. A black commander, Captain Ron Johnson, took on a special role that seems to be helping.
It's my neighborhood. You are my family. You are my friends. And I am you.
Solidarity. with a few words and walking the streets with the people. Was that wise? Joining me now to talk about the police response and how the legal process will work going forward is Seth Stoughton. He is an assistant law professor at USC and a former officer with the Tallahassee Police Department. He also has advanced training in crowd control and riot response as a member of the Special Response Team. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with Captain Ron Johnson. Do you think his role is helping the community right now?
I don't just think it's helping, I think it was absolutely essential. In the aftermath of Michael Brown's shooting, you saw protests and a very militarized police response that was very aggressive and very quick and very broad. So when he came in, he did, I think, what the community needed him to do. He reached out to them and said, I am listening to your concerns. I want to hear your frustrations. I want to communicate with you.
Now, was that mainly because he was a black man?
No, I think it was because he was being a good police officer. I think the fact that he can communicate with the crowd, not just as a black man, but as a native of Ferguson, added credibility, and it gave him extra motivation. But I think his actions were the one that I would want to see from any good police commander.
Okay, because there's been some criticism saying, well, his compassion really is inciting some of the violence, but you clearly disagree with that.
I do. I strongly disagree with that. There are many problems in a crowd control, riot response, and protest situation. And they vary tremendously from case to case. In this case, you had a community that was deeply upset by a use of force. The correct response to that is not to show more force. That's only going to aggravate the situation. So what he did when he came in and demilitarized and started to calm the situation was exactly the steps that should have been taken from the beginning.
Right. So where do you think this situation has failed? Was it with the use of force? Was it with the tanks?
I think it failed years before the Michael Brown shooting. The relationship between a police department and a community is a long-term one. And like any long-term relationship, to succeed, it needs openness, it needs trust, it needs communication, and it needs buy-in from both sides.
Right.
That failed leading up to the shooting. And what we're seeing in the aftermath of the shooting is not just a problem, it is a symptom of much, much deeper problems.
And obviously not being a member of that community, what do you think is part of the problem of there not being unity between the community and the police force? Is it race-based?
I think race is a part of it, particularly when you have a community that is 2/3 minority and you have a police force that is almost 95% white.
Right.
I think that makes it difficult to have the sort of communications and conversations that we need to have a good relationship between those two. Right. I don't know where the lack of buy-in was. I don't know enough about the community. I think there is responsibility that has to be taken on both sides for that type of communication.
Sure.
The police department, as the authority, as the government agency, has an obligation to reach out to the community. The community, and particularly community leaders, also have an obligation to reach out to the police department and open that dialogue that's so essential.
Right. And given the makeup of the police department and the makeup of the community, do you think diversity training is essential in that situation?
Absolutely. There's been, particularly in the last 10, 20 years, there's been a focus in policing on equal treatment, which is tremendously important, but equal treatment actually misses something. Equal treatment misses the cultural context of policing. When you treat a young black man the same way that you would a young white woman, you're missing the fact that one of those two had to have a conversation with their parents about fearing and respecting police authority. Right? So equal treatment is very important. As an outcome, you want people to be treated equally at the end of the criminal justice process, but in everyday interactions, training and sensitivity to cultural issues is critical.
I know that's something that the South Carolina Criminal Justice Academy does teach their new cadets on a regular basis, how to deal with the community and the appropriate response. Let's talk a little bit more now about the use of force and the equipment that's been brought in.
Sure.
I know Richland County has some similar equipment and it's really not unique, but do you think that was overkill, for lack of a better word?
I think there is a very important role in law enforcement for the type of equipment and tactics that we saw in Ferguson. However, I think that Ferguson was the wrong place and time to use them. When you have barricaded suspects, hostage situations, violent looting, then you need to break out more equipment and more training and more officers than you otherwise would. At the beginning of the Ferguson protests, before things got out of control, I think the heavily militarized response was poor strategy, and I think in many cases we saw bad tactics.
Well, what about in the very beginning with transparency? I mean, do you think there were several mistakes that were made?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, the police commanders should have been out in the community. They should have been arranging public forums, town hall meetings, and they should have been telling people, listen, we do not have all of the information yet, and it may be a while before we can get you all the information, but we are on it. We want to give you the chance to air your concerns. We are here listening to you. Here is our hand, come take it. Here are some safe zones. We will set off roadblocks so that you can march and assemble peacefully. Right. Instead, what you saw were lines of police officers who were facing against the crowd rather than walking with the crowd, which is one of the things that I think Captain Johnson turned around so well.
Well, I wish we had so much more time to talk about this, but thank you so much for being with me this morning.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We'll be right back with a final thought. Violence is not going to bring back Michael Brown or change the officer's actions. Nonviolence is not going to do that either. But fighting each other with fists and even words is not going to bring about justice. Perhaps Ferguson and the nation need to take a lesson from the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He said, nonviolence is a powerful and just weapon which cuts without wounding and ennobles the man who wields it. It is a sword that heals. We'd like to thank all of our guests this morning. Until next time, I'm Megan Norman. This is Awareness.